The sun had just begun its descent over the bustling city of New York, casting long, amber shadows through the towering skyscrapers. Inside the sleek terminal of JFK, a sense of anticipation filled the air. Among the hundreds of travelers rushing to their gates, Sarah clutched her boarding pass in one hand, her bag slung over her shoulder with the other. It had been a long day of delays, but finally, her flight to Los Angeles was ready to board. She was exhausted but relieved. The purpose of her trip, to visit her mother who had been battling a serious illness for months, had weighed heavily on her mind. It had been weeks since she had seen her mom, and each day had felt like an eternity. Sarah had always been the one to handle the tough situations in her family, but this felt different. With every moment that passed, her anxiety grew. The thought of her mother in the hospital, alone, sent waves of guilt crashing through her. What if she didn't make it in time? What if she never got to say goodbye? But as the announcement rang through the terminal, calling passengers for Flight 482, Sarah pushed those thoughts aside. She took a deep breath, straightened her back, and made her way down the jet bridge, her mind set on the journey ahead. The large aircraft stood waiting like a giant bird, its gleaming silver body reflecting the fading sunlight. She boarded the plane and made her way to her seat, nestled by the window. The flight attendant, a woman with a kind smile, greeted her and helped her settle in. The sound of passengers chatting, the soft hum of the air conditioning, and the familiar scent of recycled air filled the cabin. Sarah slid into her seat, adjusted the seatbelt, and exhaled deeply. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to relax. Just a few rows ahead, Jason, the captain of this flight, checked his watch. He had been flying for years, and there wasn't much that caught him off guard anymore. But something about this flight, something in the air, felt different. Maybe it was the odd sensation in his gut, or perhaps the way the winds had been shifting so rapidly that afternoon. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but Jason had learned long ago to trust his instincts. It was the reason he was one of the best pilots at the airline. He stood in the cockpit, reviewing the flight plan, while his co-pilot, Matt, prepared the instruments for takeoff. "How's everything looking?" Jason asked, his voice calm but sharp. Matt nodded, running a quick check through the systems. "All good. We're cleared for departure," Matt replied, but there was a slight tension in his voice that Jason didn't miss. Jason adjusted his headset and gave a final look at the weather radar. The skies were clear now, but there were reports of turbulence along their route. The kind of turbulence that could make even the most experienced passengers feel uneasy. Still, it wasn't anything to be overly concerned about. It was just a routine flight, after all. Back in cabin, Sarah glanced out the window, watching as the ground beneath her began to shrink. The plane took off smoothly, lifting into the vast blue sky. For a brief moment, she forgot about the worries of the world below. All that mattered was the rhythmic hum of the engines and the quiet peace that filled the cabin. It was as if nothing could go wrong. She pulled out her phone to send a quick message to her mom. "On the way, be there soon. Love you." She hit send, tucking the phone away as the plane climbed higher. For the next few hours, everything seemed perfect. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed, and passengers settled in for the long flight ahead. The flight attendants moved down the aisles, offering drinks and snacks, their voices a soft murmur against the low rumble of the engines. In the distance, a few light clouds dotted the sky, but the weather radar showed nothing out of the ordinary. Sarah's eyes fluttered closed for a moment as she leaned back in her seat, trying to find a comfortable position for sleep. Her mind kept drifting back to her mom, to the uncertainty of what she would face when she landed. The hours seemed to stretch on in a blur. Meanwhile, Jason and Matt were in the cockpit, going through their checks, when Jason's hand froze over the controls. The instruments were showing an unusual reading. A slight shift in the pressure system had thrown off the aircraft's altitude. It wasn't a major issue, but it was enough to warrant attention. Jason's brow furrowed. He reviewed the numbers again, then glanced at Matt. "Something's not right," Jason muttered under his breath. Matt looked over his shoulder, noticing the discrepancy. "What do you mean?" Matt asked, his voice calm but with a hint of concern. "Pressure's dropping faster than it should be," Jason replied. "It's not a huge change, but it's enough to make me uneasy. I'm going to run a systems check." Jason's hands moved over the controls, his fingers flying with practiced precision. Matt stood by, watching the monitors closely. The gentle hum of the engines continued, oblivious to the tension building in the cockpit. A few moments passed, and then Jason's voice broke the silence. "There it is. We're losing power in the left engine." Matt's eyes widened. "You sure?" Jason nodded. "We're still okay for now, but I want to alert the crew. We might need to prepare for an emergency landing." In the cabin, the announcement from the captain was calm and collected. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've encountered a minor technical issue with the aircraft. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We'll have more information for you shortly." Passengers barely registered the announcement, thinking it was just a routine precaution. But for Sarah, something in the tone of the captain's voice made her stomach tighten. She glanced nervously toward the flight attendants, who were now moving down the aisles with a new sense of urgency. The woman seated next to Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting from one attendant to the next. In the cockpit, Jason and Matt were working fast, but it was clear now. This was not a simple issue. The plane's systems were failing, one after another. What started as a minor glitch had now escalated into something far more serious. Jason's mind raced. He had trained for situations like this, but there was one thing he knew. No amount of training could predict what was coming next. The hum of the engines, once a comforting background noise, had become an unsettling vibration in the air. Sarah's heartbeat quickened as she glanced up from her book, sensing that something was wrong. The gentle, rhythmic sway of the plane had suddenly intensified. She gripped the armrests, her knuckles turning white. Above, a sudden shriek cut through the cabin, the sound of metal bending under pressure. The oxygen masks dropped with a hiss, hanging limp like ghostly pendants in the dim light of the cabin. Sarah's heart slammed against her chest. It was happening. Everything she had been afraid of, the thing she had hoped would never come to pass, was unfolding right in front of her. The air grew thin, the pressure inside the cabin plummeting. Panic spread faster than the gasps of the passengers around her. A woman a few rows ahead screamed, her voice high-pitched and frantic. Another passenger cried out for their child, but there was no answer. The flight attendants were sprinting down the aisle, their faces pale, their movements urgent. Some passengers were already pulling on their masks, their breaths coming in sharp, panicked bursts. "Stay calm. We'll be okay," a flight attendant shouted over the chaos, her voice trembling despite the forced confidence. But Sarah couldn't calm down. She had been on enough flights to know this wasn't normal. The plane was shaking uncontrollably now, jolting up and down, side to side. Every bump felt like the wings might tear off. Her stomach lurched as the sensation of free fall gripped her. A sudden lurch sent the plane nosediving, and her body was thrown into the seat in front of her. She gritted her teeth, desperately trying to hold onto her composure, but the world felt like it was spinning out of control. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, distorted by static.
"Mayday.
Mayday. We're losing altitude rapidly. Prepare for impact." His tone was calm, but the urgency behind it was unmistakable. A sinking feeling spread through Sarah's chest as the gravity of his words hit her. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't a temporary glitch. This was real. Brace for impact. Brace for impact. The flight attendants were now moving frantically through the aisles, ordering everyone to assume the crash position. Sarah's mind raced as she instinctively followed their commands. She pulled her arms tightly around her knees and buried her face in her legs. Her mind kept repeating the same thought over and over again. Please don't let this be the end. Outside the window, the landscape blurred into a terrifying mix of clouds and darkening sky. The plane pitched downward, its engines screaming in protest. Sarah's ears popped with the pressure. Time seemed to slow as she prepared for the inevitable impact. The last thing she remembered was the terrifying sound of metal screeching and the sudden, gut-wrenching force that pushed her into the seat. Then everything went black. When Sarah came to, her head was pounding, her body battered by the impact. The world around her was a cacophony of groans, the sound of twisted metal, and the eerie silence that followed a crash. Her eyes opened slowly, blinking against the haze of smoke and dust that filled the cabin. Her chest tightened as she tried to take a deep breath. Air was scarce, and the acrid smell of burnt fuel stung her nose. The seatbelt was still fastened across her, but she didn't know how long she had been unconscious. The plane had crashed. She knew that much. She could see through the shattered windows, the jagged outline of trees, thick, dark forests that loomed like specters around the wreckage. The plane had gone down in the middle of nowhere. Her stomach churned with the realization. There would be no help coming soon. Her first instinct was to move, to check on the other passengers, but pain shot through her body the moment she shifted. She gasped, clutching her side. Something was broken, though she couldn't tell what. But the pain was a minor concern compared to the bigger question. Was she the only one alive? "Help!" she screamed, but her voice was hoarse and no one responded. She tried again, weaker this time, a sense of panic rising in her chest. She had to know if anyone had survived. Her hands fumbled as she unbuckled her seatbelt. The world around her was a haze. Smoke swirled through the air, thick and suffocating. There was a faint smell of gasoline, and she realized that the wreckage was in danger of catching fire. Her heart pounded as she pushed herself upright, ignoring the waves of dizziness that swept over her. "Hello," she croaked, louder this time, her voice raw with fear. "Is anyone here?" The answer came as a weak groan from somewhere behind her. Her heart skipped. Someone else was alive. She turned, seeing a man slumped in the seat behind her. He was bloodied, his head resting awkwardly against the side of the cabin. She scrambled to him, her body protesting every movement, but she had to make sure he was okay. "Hey, are you awake? Can you hear me?" she shouted, shaking his shoulder. His eyes fluttered open, and he let out a groan of pain, lifting his hand weakly to his head. What happened?" he muttered, disoriented. Sarah could barely breathe as she knelt beside him, feeling a surge of relief that he was conscious. "We crashed," she whispered, "but we have to get out of here. This place isn't safe." He nodded weakly, but his face twisted in pain as he tried to sit up. "I'm Jason," he said, his voice hoarse. "Sarah," she replied quickly. "We need to move. Do you think you can walk?" Jason grimaced but nodded again. Together, they stumbled to the exit. Sarah's mind raced. Where were the others? Was anyone else alive? The wreckage was a twisted nightmare of metal and debris. The smell of fuel was growing stronger, and every minute counted. She couldn't afford to waste time. They crawled out of the crumpled fuselage, their legs shaking as they pushed their way through the debris. Sarah's eyes darted around, searching the wreckage for any signs of other survivors. There were scattered bodies, twisted and broken, but none of them moved. The landscape around them was eerily quiet, the forest thick and dark, its towering trees blocking any view of the sky. "Stay close," Sarah said, pulling Jason along with her. "We need to find shelter. Fast." But Jason was slowing down, his steps unsteady, his breaths labored. Sarah could feel the weight of their situation bearing down on her. They had no idea where they were, and the only certainty was that they were alone. Then came the voice, a faint sound in the distance. It was a voice calling their names. A man's voice. "Help!" It was faint but unmistakable. The darkness was thick and suffocating, wrapping itself around Sarah and Jason as they stumbled through the wreckage. The forest loomed around them, a shadowy maze of trees that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. There was no telling how far they had come or how far they still had to go. All they knew was that they were alive, barely, and the world they had known before the crash had disappeared in an instant. Sarah's head was pounding. Her side ached with every breath she took, but it was nothing compared to the gnawing pain in her chest, the fear that they might not make it. She couldn't stop looking over her shoulder, expecting the world to catch up with them. They were running from something, or maybe it was just her mind that couldn't stop racing. They had no food, no water, They had no idea where they were or if help would ever come. "We have to keep moving," she muttered to herself, more to reassure herself than to Jason. But as the words left her mouth, she saw the doubt in his eyes. He was pushing himself, but the pain was evident in his every movement. He had been a captain, a leader, but now he was just another survivor, struggling to stay alive. "Jason, stay with me," she urged, grabbing his arm to keep him steady. "We can do this. We just need to make it through the night." He nodded weakly, his breathing shallow, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, resolve. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. Together, they moved deeper into the forest, weaving through the trees as best as they could. The only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional snap of a branch, and their own labored breathing. Sarah's mind kept replaying the moments before the crash, the sudden drop, the screams, the deafening noise as the plane hit the ground. She could still feel the vibrations in her bones, like the whole world had come crashing down with them.
How had they survived?
Was this a cruel twist of fate, or was there something more to their survival? She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for sure: they had to keep moving. They had to survive. For the people they had left behind. For the people they would never see again. It wasn't long before the sun began to set, the light fading from the sky in an eerie silence. The temperature dropped sharply, and Sarah could feel the cold biting into her skin, despite the layers she had on. She knew they couldn't stop. If they did, they wouldn't survive the night. Jason stumbled again, this time more violently. He was barely holding himself together. Blood had soaked through his shirt, and it was clear he wasn't going to last much longer without medical help. Sarah's heart clenched at the thought, but she pushed it aside. They couldn't afford to think about what might happen. Only what was happening. "We need to find shelter," Sarah said, her voice harsh in the silence. She didn't know if she was talking to Jason or to herself. But the words were all she could focus on now. "We need fire. Water. We need something." Jason's eyes flickered toward her, his expression pained. "We'll find it," he rasped. Just keep going." He didn't have the strength to say more, but his words were enough. They kept moving, weaving between the trees, until Sarah's legs began to feel like lead. The forest felt endless, a labyrinth with no exit. The branches reached down like claws, scratching at her skin, but she barely noticed the pain. She could only focus on the one thing she knew she had to do: survive. A rustling noise broke through the silence, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Was it another survivor? Was it someone who could help? Or was it something else, something far worse? "Jason," she whispered, gripping his arm. He tensed, his head turning slowly toward her. His hand went instinctively to the knife at his waist, but it wasn't much protection against whatever might be out there in the dark. Another rustle, louder this time, and then a figure appeared, tall, silhouetted against the dim light of the dying day. It was a man, his face hidden in the shadows, but he didn't seem to be a threat. He was standing still, watching them with an almost eerie calm. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Jason was already positioning himself between her and the stranger, ready to defend her if necessary. The man took a slow step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice low and steady. "I saw the wreckage. I know what happened." Sarah blinked, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. "You saw the crash? How long have you been out here?" The man's gaze softened, though it was impossible to read his expression in the fading light. "Longer than I care to remember." He looked past them, toward the wreckage they had left behind. "You're lucky to be alive." Jason opened his mouth to speak, but his words were interrupted by a faint cry in the distance. A child's cry, distant but unmistakable. Sarah's heart leapt in her chest. Was it a survivor? Was there someone else out there? She started toward the sound, but Jason caught her arm, his grip firm but weak. "Sarah, wait. You can't go alone. You're in no condition to." But Sarah wasn't listening. The sound of the child's cry echoed again, and her mind raced. She couldn't just leave them out there. She couldn't leave anyone behind, Not when they had a chance to survive. "I have to help," she said, determination hardening her voice. "I have to." Jason's face twisted in frustration and fear. "We don't even know if it's real. It could be a trap." But Sarah was already moving. She pushed forward, her legs protesting with every step, but she refused to stop. She had to do this. She had to. "Sarah?" Jason's voice cracked, but he didn't stop her. Instead, he followed. They moved faster now, their exhaustion forgotten as they pushed through the underbrush, the child's cries growing louder, more desperate with each passing second. And then, finally, they saw it. A small clearing in the forest. At the center, a young boy, no more than 6 years old, was sitting in the dirt, his hands clutching at his chest as if in pain. His clothes were torn, and he was covered in dirt and cuts, but he was alive. Sarah dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking as she reached out. "Hey there," she said gently, her voice soft and reassuring despite the storm of fear raging inside her. "It's okay. We're here. You're safe now." The boy looked up at her with wide, tear-filled eyes. He didn't speak, but he clung to her, burying his face in her chest. And for a moment, just a brief moment, Sarah allowed herself to believe it, that maybe, just maybe, they could survive this. But deep down, she knew it was just the beginning. The beginning of a fight that would take everything they had just to stay alive.